When we tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach, which is mandated by this week's parasha, it's really important that we tell the story correctly. Not just that we left Egypt, but something fundamentally changed and we became inherently free people. We'll see that in how the Rambam teaches us this halacha. Kosav Rambam. Mitzvah Sasei Torah, the Rambam says that it is a positive mitzvah mandated by the Torah in this week's parasha, L'saper benisim v'nei flois shenaseh lavisenu b'Mitzrayim, that we relate the great miracles and wonders that Hashem did for our forefathers in Egypt. When do we do this? B'leil chamisha b'Nisan, on the eve of the 15th of Nisan, the first night of Pesach. And how do we know it? Shenemar, because the pasuk tells us, Zocher es hayom hazeh asher yitzasem b'Mitzrayim, remember this day that you left Egypt. And then the Rambam tells us something which seems a little bit out of place, and that is K'moshe Nemar. K'moshe Nemar, it's similar to what the pasuk says, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos, that you should remember the day of Shabbos. So the Mefarshim ask a very obvious question. First of all, what is the Rambam intend for us to understand more about the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim and remembering the Exodus at the Pesach Seder by saying that it is like the mitzvah to remember Shabbos? Because why is it not sufficient that the pasuk says, remember this day, that we have to add some kind of insight by saying, make it similar to remembering Shabbos? That's question one. Question two, Beis, let's assume the Rambam has a good reason why we want to associate remembering the Yetzias Mitzrayim with remembering Shabbos. The question is, where did the Rambam learn this from? Before we get there, so this is what the Rambam is telling us in Mishnah Torah. We're going to see what the Rambam says about this mitzvah in Sefer HaMitzvahs. Sefer HaMitzvahs, Hevi HaRambam. There, the Rambam quotes as follows: "Uloshoina milchilta." He's now referencing the mechilta, which is a medrash. Miklal shenemar kish olcha bincha. Because the Torah tells us when your child asks you about Yetzias Mitzrayim, you should tell him. So you'd think you'd think you only have to address the issue if your child asks the question. Therefore, Talmud Loimer, the pasuk adds another layer to this, v'higad levincha, that you have to take the initiative to tell your child about Yetzias Mitzrayim, even if he doesn't ask you the question. Then you'd think that the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim only applies if you have a child. But beino levein atzmo, if you're sitting alone at the Pesach Seder, or beino levein acherim, or even if you're sitting with other people who are not your children, minayin, how do I know that you have to then share the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim at Pesach? Talmud Loimer, therefore the pasuk says, V'hayorim Moshe Lam zocher es hayom hazeh, in our parasha where it says that Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jewish people, always remember this day. So the Rambam there links us back to that medrash and explains why we have to be told specifically to remember the day of Yetzias Mitzrayim on Pesach. And then he explains, what he wants us to understand, in other words, what the Torah wants us to know is, that the Eibishter wants us to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim in a way that is similar to how we remember Shabbos. In other words, what the Rambam is telling us is, from that pasuk that says, Moshe telling the Jewish people, remember this day that you left Egypt on an annual basis, teaches us that we have to tell the story of the Exodus even if we're sitting alone at the Pesach Seder, even if there's no child to ask the questions. To which the Rambam adds, that's what the Mechilta already told us, and then the Rambam adds to this, the Rambam's telling us clearly what the Torah is saying over here is that you remember Pesach like you remember Shabbos Pirush, meaning, just as you have to remember Shabbos and make Kiddush even if you're alone, the same applies to Pesach. You have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim even if on the night of Pesach you are alone. Okay, it would appear that that's the same message that the Rambam wants to convey in Mishnah Torah B'Shvas Mitzvah Zechus Yom Hazel, Zechus Yom HaShabbos, where he compares the mitzvah to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim to the mitzvah to remember Shabbos. Sounds like the Rambam there too wants us to know that the extent of the mitzvah applies even if you are sitting alone at the Pesach Seder. And you may even read that into the next thing that the Rambam tells us, which is, how do you know that the time when you're supposed to share the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is the night of the 15th of Nisan? Therefore, the Torah tells us you impart this information to your child, saying, it's because of these things that when do you tell the story, when these things, the matzah and the maror, are sitting there in front of you. And then the Rambam says, even if you don't have a child, and even if you're very wise, you still have to tell the story. So over Kavanas Advarim Bepashtus, it would appear that his intention is Shemekoir Adin v'afu b'shen leben u'me'akasav shuva lilminei zachas hayom hazeh shelo niska b'y ben v'chadoime. Would sound like, how does the Rambam arrive at this conclusion that you have to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim even to yourself and even if you have no child? From this pasuk that says, remember this day, and there's no mention of a child there at all. So maybe that's what the Rambam is getting at. The comparison between Yetzias Mitzrayim and Shabbos is that either of them has to be remembered even if there's no crowd or audience or child asking any questions. The only thing is, the truth is, it'd be really difficult to imagine that that's the only reason that the Rambam in Sefer Hayad included the expression that it is like remembering Shabbos. Why? Because if you had to just simply look at the pasuk he's quoting, which is remember this day that you left Egypt, move on, in and of itself that pasuk implies that you always have to remember the story even if you're alone, because the pasuk did not mention a child or a discussion with other people. In fact, that's what the Mechilta itself implied. And there, the Mechilta did not quote the pasuk Zachas Yom HaShabbos to verify this point. It seems glaringly clear in the pasuk that the instruction to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is child or no child from this pasuk. So, I can argue that in Sefer HaMitzvahs, I could actually use this argument why the Rambam had to invoke Shabbos in that particular conversation. Because in Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam only brought Zachas Hayom Hazeh as an additional, so to speak, appendix to the idea that you have to talk about the Yetzias Mitzrayim. But the primary source that the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs quotes to tell us that we have to share the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is It's about the fact that you have to convey the message to your child. And therefore, in that context, the Rambam has to clarify for us that there is also other information where the Torah tells us that you should remember this day regardless of whether there's a child to tell or not. But rather that the requirement to repeat the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is something that applies even if you're alone, and there it makes sense logically that it should say that is like Shabbos. So that would explain why it does it in Sefer HaMitzvahs. But in Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam only quotes one biblical source for the fact that you have to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and that is Zachar Hayom Hazeh, which does not speak about children. What would have made me think that you only have that obligation if your child is sitting there asking you questions? Which would then force the Rambam to have to quote that this is similar to remembering Shabbos, that actually the requirement applies even just when you're on your own. It seems self-evident from the pasuk. So that cannot be the reason why the Rambam said Zachas Yom HaShabbos in that particular context. We're back to square one. What is his reason? Well, here's another suggestion. Migdal Ois quotes the Mechilta that we've just seen and concludes this. The Rambam writes, that really what the Torah is telling us over here is not only that you have an obligation to tell the story even if there's nobody around to hear it, but it's emphasizing you have to tell the story at the correct time. That means when it says, by Yom Hazeh, you have to remember it on this date, that's actually the mitzvah, and that would be similar to the mitzvah to remember Shabbos, which obviously is on Shabbos. Ad kan l'shoina, that's the Migdalos. Now, apizeh, take that information, and Yeshloima, then you could suggest that that's actually the Rambam's intention over here in Mishnah Torah as well. Based on that pasuk that says, remember this day that you left Egypt. The Torah is telling us over and above the generalized mitzvah, which is to tell the story to the next generation, a specific mitzvah to tell it on this date. In addition to the fact that all year round we have a requirement to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, and that we learn from the pasuk that you have to remember the Exodus all the days of your life. So this pasuk by Yom Hazeh is saying there's a special mention that has to happen on the night of Pesach. And then the Rambam's proving that by saying this zechira, this remembrance, is like remembering Shabbos. And just as we know, Shabbos has to be remembered on the day of Shabbos, likewise, the Yetzias Mitzrayim has to be remembered on the anniversary of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And then you could also explain the next part of what the Rambam teaches us, which is, how do you know it's on the 15th? Because if I'm just relying on the pasuk that says, remember this day that you left Egypt, you might think that the mitzvah to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim happens as soon as Yom Tov begins, or maybe during the day. Therefore, he has to be more specific by quoting the pasuk that says that it's not just on this date, but there's a specific time frame within the date of the 15th of Nisan when you have to tell the story, and that's when you have matzah and maror sitting on your table. Which explains to us then that the requirement to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is at night time of the 15th, so it clarifies not during the day and not as the Yom Tov begins. But the principle that you have a unique mitzvah to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim on that specific date, over and above the generic mitzvah to record Yetzias Mitzrayim, recall Yetzias Mitzrayim daily, that's from this pasuk, Zochas Hayom Hazeh, and that relates to Shabbos. But even that's not a good enough explanation for why the Rambam is linking Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim to the mitzvah to remember Shabbos. Because if we were to follow this logic, first of all, it would seem that the primary reason we know that you have to remember Shabbos on Shabbos is from the word lekadshay, to make it a special, unique day, which follows straight after the words that the Rambam has quoted, remember the day of Shabbos. Now, if that was what the Rambam wanted to invoke from Shabbos, that just says Shabbos has to be a special day set aside from the rest of the week to remember what Shabbos represents, then, and in the same way, Pesach, he should have quoted the word lekadoshay. But that's a technical question. There's also a logical question. Still doesn't make sense. If the goal is that the Rambam's showing us, Zochas Hayom Hazeh is teaching me the unique mitzvah that on the 15th of Nisan, at night, I have to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim more so than any other day of the year when I have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. Well, then, the truth is the Rambam shouldn't have quoted the pasuk that says, remember this day that you left Egypt. Which then forces the Rambam to have to prove that this means on the day, because it's similar to Shabbos, which is on the day. Remember, the next thing the Rambam is going to do is going to quote the pasuk that clarifies not only the date, but what time of day you're supposed to tell Yetzias Mitzrayim. That you have to tell your child Bayomahu on that day, at that specific time. So why do we need Zochas Hayom Hazeh and then explain what it means based on Shabbos when you're about to tell us anyway this clear mitzvah that you have to recount the story of the Exodus in all of its detail on Leil Chamisha Osar Benisan? That cannot be the reason why why the Rambam linked it to Shabbos, and therefore we still have the original question. Taka, why? So as a number of the Mefarshim point out, that the Rambam bases this idea that we're comparing Pesach and Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim to Shabbos. It's based on a Medrash Rabbah. It's in that Medrash that it makes a connection and a similarity between remembering Shabbos and remembering Pesach. Here is the quotation directly from the Medrash. Israel, you need to instruct and warn the Jewish people in the same way as I created the world. And then the Eibishter says, and I instructed the Jewish people to have a Shabbos on a weekly basis to remember the process of how I created the world, as the pasuk tells us, remember Shabbos. Likewise, you need to remember the miracles I did for you in Egypt, and remember the day that you left Mitzrayim, to remember, as the pasuk says. In other words, the Midrash is saying the purpose of Shabbos is to remind us that the Eibishter created the world, and therefore we have to know that the purpose of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is to remind us that the Eibishter did miracles and took us out of Egypt. That is what the Rambam is conveying in the Sefer HaMitzvahs by linking the Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim to Shabbos. Except it raises a very important question, because is this what the Rambam normally does in Sefer Hayad? We have to understand. We very well know that the Mishnah Torah is an encyclopedia of Jewish law. It's not a place for the Rambam just willy-nilly to quote different midrashic insights of the Chazal. We must ask ourselves, what halachic take-home is there from this principle that the Rambam is comparing Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim to remembering Shabbos? In other words, the way in which you remember Yetzias Mitzrayim has to reflect the way in which you remember Shabbos. What's the practical halachic difference in saying that? Now we're getting to the meat and potatoes of this message. In this halacha, where the Rambam is describing the mitzvah to recall the Exodus, the Rambam's primary intention here is to show us the distinction between how you recall the Exodus from Egypt on the night of Pesach versus how you do so any other day of the year. So the additional layer of mitzvah that we have to tell the story of the Exodus, which occurs on Pesach night, so it's not just because the rest of the year, as long as you say those words, you mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, you've done your duty. Whereas on the night of Pesach, you have to get into the details. You have to tell the story. You can't just mention a one-liner, thank you Hashem for taking us out of Mitzrayim. The Rambam saying that's true, but there's more. But there's a fundamental difference to the nature of the mitzvah of recalling Yetzias Mitzrayim during the year and on Pesach. All year round, to fulfill the mitzvah, all you need to acknowledge is that the Eibishter took us out of Mitzrayim. Which is acknowledging that the Eibishter took us out of a place where we were oppressed and subjugated. Whereas on Pesach night, as the Rambam tells us, whereas on the night of Pesach, it's not just good enough to say we were slaves and now we're free. You have to speak about the miracles that were involved in that process. All of the miracles that were engaged in the process of Yetzias Mitzrayim, going all the way to Kriyas Yamsuf, actually. How do I know that that is, in fact, the geder, the requirement of the mitzvah, not just simply to say we were slaves and now we're free? That the Rambam, that halachic parameter for how you fulfill the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim on Pesach night, that the Rambam illustrates by comparing it to Shabbos. When the Torah tells us, remember this day that you left Egypt, doesn't tell us overtly that the mitzvah on that day, which is actually the night of Pesach, that we have to get into all the detail of all of the miracles. You don't see that clearly in the pasuk. So where do we learn it from? Therefore the Rambam makes this link that the meaning of the word remember in this context is similar to the context of remembering Shabbos. As we've already seen from the Medrash Rabbi, the purpose of remembering Shabbos is to remember the story of creation. As we say clearly in the pasuk, remember Shabbos because the Eibishter made the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Going back to the Medrash Rabbi, which said, just as when you remember Shabbos, you have to use that as a means of invoking a memory of the process of creation. So too, on the night of Pesach, you have to remember all of the miracles associated with Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, we need to understand why this is so significant and what the message is in order for us to understand and appreciate what Yetzias Mitzrayim is all about. So, let's take this a notch deeper. The fact that we're comparing how you tell the story, or the meaning behind telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, to remember the Nisim Niflois that Eibishter did, is comparable to Shabbos. It's not just telling us so we'll know the methodology that we have to use to include all the miracles. Rather, the Rambam here is opening the conversation for what's to come in the subsequent halachas. And to understand where the Rambam's going with this, let's look at the Rambam's introduction to the laws of Shabbos, where he says, the fact that you have to rest on the seventh day from doing work, mitzvah saseh, is a positive mitzvah. Shenem, as the pasuk tells us, you have to rest on the seventh day. And if anybody does any of these 39 categories of work over the course of Shabbos, bitul mitzvah saseh, they have both negated a positive mitzvah, the positive mitzvah to rest, and they've transgressed the prohibition against work. In other words, the Rambam's telling us right at the get-go when he speaks about the laws of Shabbos, that there are two aspects to Shabbos. On the one hand, there is the restriction of Shabbos, the prohibitions against types of work that we may not perform. Those are the restrictions. But there's also a positive aspect of Shabbos, the aseh lishbois, the positive mitzvah to rest. So that's an important insight to understanding Shabbos. Now, there are two possibilities over here. There is the part of Shabbos that stops us doing certain activities, and there's a part of Shabbos that tells us to rest. Which one does the Rambam prioritize? First, he speaks about resting. Even though the bulk of all the laws of Shabbos are about the restrictions, yet the Rambam starts first with the positive mitzvah to rest. Most of the conversation is about the 39 categories of work and all of the subcategories. Move on. The Rambam is teaching us here that the primary goal of Shabbos is not simply not to work. The primary part of Shabbos is the positive aspect of Shabbos. As the Rogatchover tells us, that the mitzvah saseh, the positive mitzvah, is to rest, not just to desist from working. And the Rogatchover goes on to explain various practical halachic applications. Because, for example, when it comes to educating your children, the requirement that you have to educate your children is what positive mitzvahs they should be doing. So, for example, over here, you have to be educating your children not just simply not to work on Shabbos, but to actually experience menucha on Shabbos. He also speaks about how this relates to non-Jewish people or animals, etc. Now, he's given us, the Rambam, two perspectives on Shabbos, with the priority being the most important thing of Shabbos is the rest, and then secondly, there are all these rules that restrict work. Now, how does the Rambam get to the idea that there are two fundamental parts of Shabbos, a positive rest and a negative desist from work? Each one is based on a different part of the Torah that tells us about Shabbos. The first time we encounter Shabbos is b'Maaseh Bereishis, in the story of creation. There it says, that the Eibishter rested from all the work that he had done to create the world. And the Eibishter blessed and sanctified Shabbos because this was the day that he stopped working. That's the part of the Torah that tells us Shabbos is about not doing work. But then later on, when we were instructed about Shabbos, based on Matan Torah, at the time of the giving of the Torah, then it tells us, remember the day of Shabbos and sanctify it. And then it says, that David over 6 days created heaven and earth and everything within them. And he rested on the seventh day. For which reason, David blessed and sanctified Shabbos. In other words, this is highlighting that the greatness of Shabbos is not just that all of the work of creation ended, which is what we were told in Parashas Bereishis, not that the Eibishter worked 6 days and then rested. Not just Vayishbois, he stopped working, but Vayonach, there is this experience of rest, which is intrinsic to Shabbos. In other words, Matan Torah is telling us a deeper perspective of what Shabbos is all about. And that's exactly what is highlighted in those words in the Aseret HaDibros. Remember Shabbos. Remember that the context and definition of Shabbos is its positive message. We shouldn't simply remember that today is different from any other day because there's certain things I cannot do. Most importantly, I have to remember that there's something positive about this day which is distinct from any other day on the calendar. This is the day that the Eibishter rests. As Rashi tells us, at the end of creation, the world was missing something. What was it missing? Menuchat was missing rest. When Shabbos entered the space, then rest entered the space. That is the unique aspect that Shabbos, the positive aspect that Shabbos brings, is the aspect of rest. And therefore the Rambam puts that as the first idea that you have to know about Shabbos. And that positive resting is what's expressed in remembering Shabbos. Like the Rambam says, that what does it mean to remember Shabbos? With praise and with sanctification, making Kiddush, Havdalah, and all the various things that we do to acknowledge that this is a positively unique day. So we know now that Shabbos has two components, the practical, don't work, and the positive aspect of it, become in a state of rest. This is the deeper meaning of why it is that the Rambam links the mitzvah of recalling the Exodus with the mitzvah of Shabbos, because because also in the mitzvah of remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim, the focus should be on the positive impact of Yetzias Mitzrayim, not only what we escaped. In other words, two things happened to the Jewish people at the time of the Exodus. Aleph, the most obvious, is they were no longer slaves, and they were no longer subjected to the Egyptians. Beis, what's maybe not always so obvious, even though it should be, is the fact that they became free people who were capable of their own self-determination. You actually see this reflected any time that an Eved was freed. Because first you have Aleph, Bitul Shibudo Le'odon, you have the end, the cessation of the control of the master, that is now released from the jurisdiction of the Odon. And then Beis, the fact that he now becomes an independent operator who can live freely. And they are two halachically, but they're two completely different things. As illustrated in how the halachic mechanism works when a slave goes free in the Yovel year. Because there you see that these two stages actually happen at two different times. Look at how the Rambam describes it. That between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Avodim did not yet go home, so they were not yet free independent people, but they were no longer working for their masters, which means that the authority of the masters over them had been removed and neutralized. And then, but when Yom Kippur would come along, then Toku Beis Shofar, then the basin would blow a shofar, and then Niftar Avodim Lebatein, then the slaves were free to go home. That means there are two stages. The stage of being released from somebody else's control, and then the stage of becoming your own person. And those two apply to Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's what the Rambam is illustrating, and it's actually quite an insight that we wouldn't have known without the Rambam. Just like on Shabbos, when we remember Shabbos, we're not primarily remembering that this is a day not to turn on lights or drive or write or plant flowers. But rather we're primarily remembering that this is a day of rest, which means it's an elevated day compared to any other day on the calendar. So the Rambam's invoking an insight from that in the same way when it comes to telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, we shouldn't be focused only on the fact that we escaped, that we were no longer slaves, that we got out of the clutches of Paroi. And what we're supposed to primarily focus on the night of Pesach is the positive, that we became independent people, that we are no longer dictated to by the world. And the Rambam re-emphasizes this point immediately. Because the Rambam says, what happens if you're telling the story of Egypt, of the Exodus from Egypt, to the simplest recipient? The Heilige Derech Shem ben Katan Tipish, in the Rambam's words, you're speaking to a young child or an immature child. Then the way you're supposed to tell the story is, we were all slaves. Like so-and-so, who's that person's slave? We were like that. So, the Rambam here is talking about the simplest way to tell the story. You'd expect him to keep it very short and concise, and yet he doesn't just simply say, he doesn't just round it off by saying, and this is the night that we were all freed. Ella, he says specifically, you have to tell that little child, tonight is the night that the Eibishter freed us, and took us out into a state of freedom. That's an expression that clarifies and emphasizes not only that the Eibishter took us out of the cauldron, but that he granted us a freedom. And therefore that translates into a practical halacha that the Rambam describes, that every person has to view themselves as if you personally left Mitzrayim right now. The Rambam says, view yourself as if you were a slave who was freed and was given that you became an independent person, which is why the way that you eat the meal over the course of the Seder night has to be to express freedom. Everything you do on this night has to exemplify that you are not only no longer a slave, but that you are in fact a free spirit, a free person. That detail the Rambam also extracted out of the Medrash Rabbah. Because there the Medrash says, this is the day that you have to remember that the Eibishter took you out of Mitzrayim. Lama? Why? Because Hashem took you out with a strong arm. Why is it so important? Consistently emphasize the strong arm. Surely the necessity of a strong arm, which implies these incredible miracles that completely bust the rules of nature, surely that's not so important in order to get us out of slavery. Because the original decree that the Eibishter shared with Avraham Avinu was that there is a time limit, and after 400 years it ends, the oppression and slavery ends. But as soon as that time arrived, the door should have flung open automatically, and the Jews would have left automatically, and there's no need for miracles because the Eibishter makes a promise it's going to happen. So what are the miracles for? The miracles were to create this positive shift in terms of who we are. To make us free people intrinsically, not free people just practically because nobody's breathing down our back, but intrinsically. A unique nation on earth who is fundamentally free, that as long as they are a nation, which is eternally, because we're an eternal nation, we are absolutely free. And even if we have pockets of time in our history where we get taken back into some kind of subjugation, that is never who we are. In Egypt, we were slaves. Subsequently, in Golus, we are held in a Golus, but we are fundamentally B'nai Chorin. As the Rambam continues later in this chapter, where he says, the fact that you have to end off your story of telling Yetzias Mitzrayim with praise, the Rambam defines that to mean that what we're supposed to share with each other is the truth that the Eibishter brought us to. And that he distinguished us from all other people and made us one with him, or allowed us closeness to his oneness. And then he says it clearly, and we have to acknowledge the miracles and wonders that he did with us and with granting us our freedom, because the key of Yetzias Mitzrayim is not what we got away from, but what we became. The Rebbe has previously explained multiple times, if we have a principle that we learn from a different source, even though you think, okay, listen, that source is just to help us clarify what the law is or what the context is in a particular situation. In other words, if I need to know this information, I'll need that information to help me get there. but Torah is complete. And therefore Torah is absolutely precise in every single detail. Therefore, we must insist that when you look at things deeper, the source we're learning from is not only there to give us the context how we should learn the particular outcome, if this is the source I'm learning something from, then that is the cause of why this is, or at the very least, what clarifies for us why this is. And that would be clearly the case in the comparison between Shabbos and Yetzias Mitzrayim. As we well know, the Rambam embeds mystical teachings inside his halacha books, but not in a way that you can immediately detect. And I've asked her with their but all in hints, like the Rambam's grandson says, Rabbi David Anagid says, that Yesodis V'Amud HaChochma is the first words of Mishnah Torah, spell out Yud Kei Vav Kei. That illustrates that the Rambam is embedding mystical principles inside his halacha. So Chassidus explains that there are these two aspects of Shabbos we've identified. On the one hand, that you're supposed to desist from working. Like the pasuk says in Bereshis, this is the day that David stopped working. Then is the positive state of rest, which is described in Matan Torah, because that's the day that David rested. Chassidus explains that is two different levels and layers of the experience of Shabbos. Shabbos Delilah, over Suda Shabbos HaSuda Harishona. There's the first part of Shabbos which happens at night, and particularly at the first meal. Shabbos D'Yom, and the daytime experience of Shabbos Suda Shnia, which is the second meal as well. Now, what's the distinction between them? So let's first remember, what is Shabbos all about? Klolus Inyona Shal Shabbosu v'Korasa LeShabbos Oineg. Shabbos is supposed to be a day of pleasure. Inyona Oineg, that it's supposed to be a day that we experience pleasure. And there are two levels of pleasure that we could experience. There's the great pleasure of, I don't have to work today. That feels amazing. Which is the Eibishter reflecting in the human experience. Here we were focused and kind of limited in the weekdays requirements. All that effort that I invested and shared with the world and had to constrict myself into the world all comes back. And I have this opportunity just to recompose myself. That's very pleasurable. But this is pleasure that is relative to work. In other words, the fact that I'm not working, or that those efforts I invested in my work are no longer invested in the work, that's where the pleasure comes from. This is like my soul is kind of returning, rejuvenating after having exerted itself. It's a very personal pleasure. Which is obviously relative to whatever I was doing during the week, and that will determine how much pleasure I have from the fact that I'm not working during the week. Then, there's a much deeper kind of pleasure, which is the pleasure that a person gets from a fundamental intrinsic state of rest, which is the next step that you achieve after you've stopped working. In other words, that means I key in to a type of pleasure which is completely beyond the whole work reality. What does that mean? These are the two aspects of how we observe Shabbos. We have to remember Shabbos and we have to keep Shabbos. So in Kabbalistic terms, we say Shomer is you protecting the feminine energy, which is basically how we invest in the world. The Eibishter's Malchus, which is the feminine energy that makes the world run, that has to rest on Shabbos. That is associated with the kind of rest that you experience on Friday night, which makes sense. You're tired from the week, Friday night, you're resting. That's when you feel that you can breathe. So in general terms, when we're speaking about Elikus, this is the level of a Malakal Omen. This is where the Eibishter invests in his world, much like we're investing in our work. And that happens This is during the week where the Eibishter's energy is being manifested in the world, and therefore obviously has to be greatly filtered and contracted in order to do so. So when it comes Friday night, we can take off that persona that we had, that garment that we had that blocked our reality from the world, and we can actually just be ourselves, which means that the Eibishter, who's, so to speak, constantly limiting his energy in order to facilitate the work week, can now take off that blockage, and we can enjoy and experience more godliness in the world, and that's obviously a great pleasure. Then there's v'zocher litchora. Then there's the part where you remember Shabbos. That's considered aligned with the masculine energy. That's the Eibishter's energy that never got involved in the world, never got contaminated in the process of creation. Madregas Yom Shabbata. That's the experience you have on the day of Shabbos. Gilui Or HaSevev Kol Olmin. That's when we are exposed to the Eibishter's Sevev Kol Olmin energy, which is completely beyond and unlimited by and unrelated to the details of creation. Something that never enters the space of work and contraction and filtration and having to conform. And therefore it's menucha ba'etzem. It's always in a state of absolute rest, meaning to say it never has to get involved in work. Now that links to the fact that out of all the Yomim Tovim, Pesach is the one that's called Shabbos in the Pasuk. Because the kind of miracles and wonders that we saw in the process of the Exodus were completely outside of the realm of existence, of nature, of creation. Therefore, they are a manifestation of this higher level, Sovev Kolomim, something that is not bound by the restrictions of the world, and therefore it's real Shabbos energy. That's what the Rambam is telling us. That our requirement on Shabbos is to share the miracles that happened to our forefathers in Mitzrayim, because you have to remember this day. That is very much like remembering Shabbos, not just remembering the day of Shabbos, the time of Shabbos, but the energy of Shabbos. That means, how do we have the capacity or the mitzvah that we have on Pesach to speak about the positive, that we're b'nei chorin, that we're freed from the world? That derives from the remembrance of Shabbos. We get that from the positive side of Shabbos, which is the capacity to rest, because there's fundamentally rest, not just because I'm breathing in between work weeks. Because Shabbos is keys in to an energy which is completely beyond the world. So when it does enter the world, as it did on Pesach, it's in a completely miraculous way, not only miraculous, but pele, a way that is completely confounding to us. Miracles which are not manifested in the natural order. And when you have that kind of energy flowing into the world, something that is not bound by the restrictions and natural cycles of the world, that empowers us to be truly free, meaning free of the shackles of the world. Because Geula comes from Shabbos, which is a world of freedom. Which means that when we left Mitzrayim, it's not just that we threw off the shackles of Egypt. It means that we were catapulted into a reality that is completely outside of all natural things, including the spiritual natural reality, and therefore we're inherently free people, different to any other being that exists. Now, we don't necessarily see that in our own experience. That will be fully manifest when Mashiach comes very soon. That's when we'll have absolute freedom in the truest and fullest sense. And it will be a time where we see tremendous miracles and wonders, as the Pasuk tells us, that the Eibishter promises the kind of miracles and greater, like we had at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And that's going to take us over into that time period which is considered the day of absolute Shabbos forever and ever. And it's Hashem, that should manifest right now.